When I was about 10 and my brother John about 13, the Billy Jack movies were big. Billy Jack, The Trial of Billy Jack Goes to Washington. These were movies tailor-made for prepubescent boys. Billy Jack was a Vietnam veteran. He was half Native American. He was somehow a pacifist and a martial arts expert. And as I remember him, he seemed to spend most of his time protecting other Native Americans, especially the residents of his California town, from racist motorcycle gangs. He was that character, the morally righteous outsider, who is so often the hero in American cinema. As I remember things, my older brother was more of a Billy Jack fan than I. He even took to wearing a broad-brimmed black hat, just like Billy Jack. And because my older brother didn't like going to church very much, even at that age, he took to wearing the black hat into church and keeping it on as a sort of protest against my father's every Sunday rule. Ugh. I grew to hate that hat, his t-shirts, his suspenders, the succession of paperbacks like Serpico in the Odessa File that he began to bring with him into church and read during the sermons and communion. Even as a 10-year-old, the look of things mattered to me terribly. I had already absorbed a certain unyielding sense of propriety. Since my parents didn't seem to be taking any action, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I decided to write to Ask Beth in the Boston Globe. Beth was Elizabeth Winship, a therapist, and in her column in the Globe in those years, she answered questions largely from teens and preteens. In her picture, she looked like a kindly, vaguely hip grandmother. Dear Beth, I remember writing, my brother insists on humiliating all of us by dressing up like Billy Jack when we go to church. My parents won't make him stop. What should I do? I found a stamp and I mailed this off. And beginning the next day, I watched the Globe carefully. But months passed and Beth didn't answer, and I think I forgot all about ever having written. Forgot, that is, until one night at supper. Hey, said my brother Larry, did anyone see that letter last week to Ask Beth? Patrick could have written that thing. What? I said. I could feel my face getting hot. I felt, strangely, embarrassed, as if I had somehow contributed to the public shaming of my brother. My brother Larry went on. Some kid writes in and says he hates that his brother dresses like Billy Jack to go to church. It seemed that every single person in my family of 8 had caught Beth's letter, except me. My father was staring right at me with an amused smile on his face. I managed to sputter, well, what did Beth say? Kind of that the kid is uptight and shouldn't worry too much about what his brother wears. Oh, I said. I felt sick. My brother John seemed to tune out the whole conversation, but both of my parents were looking down the table at me intently and smiling. Something wrong, Patrick? Asked my father. No. Well, good. I'm so glad. There was a man who had 2 sons. Of every parable Jesus tells, this may be the most beloved, the most familiar, the most internalized. The return of the prodigal is the subject of countless paintings and stained glass windows. If you walk straight out of the central west door this morning and look up to your left, you'll see that this return is carved there in stone. The father and the prodigal, servants with robe and fatted calf. Look for it if you've never seen it before. You may know Rembrandt's famous painting of this scene, the father leaning in to embrace the returning son. Just like that image of the mother hen in Luke's gospel from last week, he's almost folding the tattered prodigal in under a protective wing. Rembrandt takes artistic license and paints the older brother in at the reunion moment, and the older brother stands aloof and stiff, off to one side, his hands folded tightly against his chest, incapable in this moment of joy or compassion. There was a man who had 2 sons. Jesus says those words, begins this story, because the Pharisees and the scribes have been grumbling about the tax collectors and the sinners who share Jesus' table. So it's rather easy to connect the parallels. The sinners and the tax collectors are embodied in the repentant prodigal. The censorious scribes and Pharisees are represented in the unyielding older brother. There was a man who had 2 sons. Now, usually when this story is taken up in Bible studies, people tend to identify with one sibling or the other. Usually, when we do so identify, we tend to indulge in what a therapist, perhaps even Elizabeth Winship, would understand as negative introspection. Negative introspection. I'm the older brother, says one. I have a hard time forgiving and relaxing. I'm obsessed with being correct. I'm the prodigal, says another. I tend to make a mess out of things. I still haven't gone home. Negative introspection. The late Verna Dozier, writer and theologian and Christian educator, once said that we should always pay special attention to the first person mentioned by Jesus in any parable. The first person mentioned. There was a man who had 2 sons. There was a man. What if we didn't refer to the story as the return of the prodigal son? What if we instead called it, thought of it, internalized it, instead as the man with 2 sons? What do we know about this man, this father? Well, for one thing, he is pure, unbounded love. He is the wideness in God's mercy. Think of how he treats his children. A son leaving home was next to unheard of in the world of Jesus. And to ask for an advance on the inheritance was tantamount in the ancient Near East to saying, "You're already dead to me." And yet the Father gives. And yet the Father releases. Such pain to release a beloved, to let them be who they think they want to be, to refrain from patronizing or a guilt-inducing lecture or deliberate constraint, and simply to release. That the father sees the prodigal returning from a great distance suggests that he has been scanning that horizon for years. He is filled with compassion. Compassion to suffer with when the prodigal finally returns. He likewise refuses to admonish the elder son, this ball of anger and self-righteousness and resentment. He could have said, "Don't be so judgmental." He could have said, "Why are you angry simply because I'm being generous?" But instead the father pleads, "Come, be with us. I want you near to me." This is a parable, after all, and not an analysis of a family system, no matter how good the material and how rich the characters. Jesus is trying to tell us about the kingdom of God here, how things work at the deepest level of reality, beneath sibling rivalry and goods and kindred and black hats in church and asking Beth. Filled with compassion, this Father, filled with compassion. What the late priest and writer Henry Nouwen has suggested, that it is the Father here in Jesus' parable, through whom the love of God, the kingdom of God, is revealed. And in this kingdom, there is one basis only for authority. It's not being right. It's not being rich. It's not about being correct. It's about one's capacity for compassion. Compassion. The capacity to suffer with. The capacity to let the needs of the other take precedence. The unwillingness to reshape others according to our own wishes for them, but to let them flourish on their own terms. How would our own lives be different? How would our politics be different if we were to understand publicly compassion as the basis for authority in this world? The authority of compassion, writes Henry Nouwen, comes from letting the sins of his children pierce his heart. There is no lust, greed, anger, resentment, jealousy, or vengeance in his lost children that has not caused immense grief to his heart. The grief is so deep because the heart is so pure. From the deep inner place, where love embraces all human grief, the Father reaches out for his children. The touch of his hands, Nouwen concludes, radiating inner light, seeks only to heal. Seeks only to heal. This is how it works in the kingdom of God, says Jesus. For prodigal and elder brother, scribe, Pharisee, sinner, and tax collector alike. Paul this morning pushes it one step further in his letter to the church at Corinth. God has given us the ministry of reconciliation, he says. We are not to count trespasses against others, but have instead been entrusted with something, a message of reconciliation. It doesn't matter what is behind us, says Jesus. The carelessness and selfishness of the prodigal, the resentment and sanctimony of the elder brother. Your history, your own worst self, should not bind you. Should not bind you because you have been built to find your true voice, your true authority in compassion. You are the one, simply, in and through whom the fullness of God's love is to be revealed. What this means is new life for ourselves, for our politics, for the fate of our tired, depleted earth, for our future. We who have been dead, says Jesus, are meant for new life. We who have been lost, says Jesus, have been found. That makes the heart of Christ rejoice. Something wrong? Says the Father to the Son. No. Well, good. I'm so glad.